My name is Techau. I'm the director of Carnegie Europe, a foreign policy think tank in Brussels. We are part of the Carnegie family of 5 think tanks around the world, part of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, but we are very much a European office that looks at Europe's role in the world, really. I mean, the kind of position that this continent can take on the international stage. I started to work for the German Defense Ministry and then got the opportunity to change over to a think tank and to build their Europe program in Berlin. And that's when I started to focus a lot more on EU foreign policy and the EU's future in the wider sense. And from there it kind of developed. But it is important also for us and for me here at Carnegie Europe to always think about Europe not only strictly in terms of the EU, but also as a continent, as part of the Western civilization, and that means that we're also thinking about NATO issues. That means that we're also thinking about, the relationship of Europeans with the neighborhood, with the Russians, with the Americans. So not everything is just seen within the framework of the EU.
It's now November 2013. Where were you 24 years ago? In Germany, I guess?
When the wall came down?
Yes.
Well, the day the wall came down, I was actually on a ferry on the way to London. And we were on a school trip to London. I was 17 and we were going for a long weekend kind of trip over to London. And the next morning, after the wall had come down, we arrived in the British harbour, in the English harbour, and bought a newspaper there and then found out what had happened. So that was a huge surprise at the time. So I wasn't in Germany, but then the week after, immediately, we put something together. We went to the border, and I come from northern Germany, from Lübeck. The wall is just behind the city limits, so it was very easy for us to get there. And then a week after that, I got on the train and went to Berlin and chiseled out my own little piece of the wall, which I still have. The big change in that period of time that you're talking about since '89 was the Maastricht Treaty. When, very, very basically spoken, a very strong political element of political integration and political cooperation was attached to a union that had, for the most part, been an economic kind of enterprise. That was the game changer. Mm-hmm. And this is also when we saw for the first time real opposition against the project. Timid at the time, but really substantial. And ever since then, it's been a politically hypercharged project. And all of the subsequent treaties, Amsterdam and Nice, and then later on Lisbon, further politicized this thing, which in a sense is a logical consequence. In my opinion, you can't have very deep economic integration, very, very deep economic integration, without also the political side having to follow suit. If you try to keep the two separate, you will get into trouble. The treaties since Maastricht have always been an attempt to integrate further on the political side as well, and that is yet to be fulfilled. It's not there, and at the moment, in November of 2013, the chances for fulfillment look very, very slim, but the gap between the economic and the political integration is still very much the issue at the macro level, if you want to look at it that way, which keeps us busy. Why am I so pessimistic at the moment about the situation and about the prospects of getting more integration is very clear. I mean, look at the political atmosphere in Europe. We are in a bind. We have an economic model that needs the political framework, but there's very little appetite politically, neither with the political elites nor with the people in the street, to integrate further, to go for real political integration. And it gets very, very complicated. You have an economic project that can't survive without the political side, but you have no appetite for the political side. So what do? Do you separate the two? Do you go further with the Eurozone and leave the rest behind? Do you create a real two-tier Europe? If you don't reform, can you, just muddle through, the way that we've done over the last 10 years? Or will that produce the next big crisis? Because if you don't go to the root cause, then, it's the illness will come back again. Those are the big questions at stake. The problem is that there's no political appetite, no political capital anywhere in the member states to make that political investment. Quite the opposite. European publics have become more skeptic about Europe, also partly because of the big economic crisis. They see globalization and Europe, which is part of globalization, as a root cause for all of their economic problems. There's a resurgence of nationalistic feelings, or at least, parts of that. We see that almost everywhere, from some of the Scandinavian countries, even to Germany, to the Netherlands, to Southern Europe, to France particularly, but also the Czech Republic and others. All across Europe you have these movements that are partly protest movements against bad economic conditions, but are also partly protest movements against the loss of sovereignty. And then you have globalization and the rise of China, and the relative weakness of the United States, which makes people feel very uncomfortable about globalization as a whole. They see globalization and the economic integration of Europe into the world as a source of instability and potentially a menace.
Are they right about this menace feeling?
I think they're profoundly wrong about it. I think, yes, the world, of course, is a hugely challenging place, but it's a much more promising place than it has ever been before. Europe lives at peace and is politically stable in a way that it has never been before, really, in its history. And if the Europeans play it well and come from a very strong position, political stability, relatively good education, open societies, innovative societies, and take that to the world and take that to the world market, very, confidently, there's lots that they can gain from globalization. There's a lot of unjustified fear, and partly also justified fear, because we've also committed a number of pretty big mistakes in the last 2 generations, essentially. As Europeans, we've lived beyond our means. We have high levels of debt everywhere. That's not the cause of a problem everywhere and for everything, but it's a huge problem. We have underinvested in our educational systems. We've essentially ruined our education systems all across Europe. And so competition will get harder for us. We've created, welfare states that we won't be able to sustain. We have a demographics that doesn't look so good. We would have to work really, really very hard to turn the opportunities that we have into great outcomes. It is possible. Europe has fantastic times ahead of it if it wants to, but at the moment it's very timid and small-minded, and that can turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's the real big problem. We are not the most dynamic economic space in the world because we've created a very encrusted system. Our economies can't really, breathe the way that they should breathe. We don't have intelligent, integration schemes and immigration schemes. We need to have them because our demographics look bad. So we need to have people coming in at pretty grand scale to sustain our systems. Are we doing anything smart about immigration and integration? Doesn't look like it. As I said earlier, our educational systems are not great. High schools are not as good as they used to be. Our universities don't feature in the international rankings very highly. We are not the leading educational part on the planet. That's bad. That's a long-term thing. And then the foreign policy side of this. With America getting relatively weaker, but Europe having global interests around the world, everywhere, from Asia to Africa to other parts of the planet, we are a global player already, which means that we will have to pay for that. We can't outsource this any longer to somebody else who does all the ugly stuff for us. We will be asked to foot the bill for this at some point. It's already starting. It will get a lot more dramatic over the next 10 to 15 years. And are politicians roughly speaking about this? Not too much. I'm not a proponent of a federal superstate. I don't think that this is an option. I don't even think it's desirable. What I do think is desirable, however, is more integration in some parts of this project. And what I also do think is that even without classic integration, without community method, member states need to behave in their national politics more Europe-friendly. For example, in foreign policy. We will never have a fully integrated EU foreign policy, and I'm not advocating this. But what I'm asking for is that European governments, when they formulate their ambitions and make their analyses, that they take into consideration very much the partnership that they can potentially have in Europe, that they act together more strongly. When it comes to the federalism issue, don't want to dodge the issue because it's very important. One of the other eternal truths in this is that if we want to integrate more in some parts, we will start to have real participation of European citizens in this European project. And I think that this is not very much a Eurobubble kind of argument. I think the Eurobubble is quite happy with the status quo in terms of how things are being set up here. But we do have a European legitimacy issue. People have the feeling out there in the member states, talk to them all the time, that in this bubble we're doing all kinds of things and they have no say in it. But no political system can survive without letting the people participate in it in the long term. This is what the Chinese are starting to find out. And this is what we have to find out as well. The European Parliament in its current composition is a disaster. It's not going to solve the democratic legitimacy issue of the EU. And so we need to find something else. The only way out in the long term is, or even in the medium term is, real participation, real political competitiveness and competition at the European level. Not just, elections in 28 countries, and then you sum it up and create some kind of indirect legitimacy. You need more direct legitimacy. I think you do it mostly by trusting your citizens, by trusting that citizens in the end will be interested in political competition and will create the kind of political process for it. America organizes democracy with 300 million people. India organizes that with, 1 billion people. Both have their issues and both have their problems and are not perfect, but both organize democracies at this level. The size is not the issue here. The issue is that the political elites need to basically create a system that will expose them a lot more. And I have ideas how to organize it. It's not so very difficult. What you need at the start of a competitive process at the European level is a political price that you can win. You need to create some kind of incentive why people should actually strive for European power. You need to elect the European Council President, or you need to change the way the European Parliament is elected so the actual result means something in terms of power. Once you have that price and you put it on the board and say, you can win this, parties and political elites will organize themselves in a European way to win it. If the only way to win real power is to organize at the European level, parties and politicians and citizens will organize themselves in a European way. I think it's very clear. Hypothetically, let's say we vote for a European Council President. And the only way to win that position is to get a pan-European majority in all 28 member states. But when you have elections in your home country, what happens is you sit in front of the television or on the web and you check it out and you have an emotional reaction to it. I don't like that person. I really like this person, wrong party, but it kind of makes sense what she says. I hate this person. You have this kind of emotional attachment. All of a sudden you have buy-in into the political system. If you create the same thing at the European level, and all of a sudden there's a Greek running against a Portuguese, running against a Finn, running against a Pole and a German or a Brit, and you see them debate and you see them interacting with each other, presenting their programs, you'll get the same kind of emotional buy-in. The risk is, of course, that the voter will not, tell you the great things about ever closer union. But at least you get a political mandate for the kinds of things you want to do. It's all about legitimacy. You can't run a political system like this one forever on just hoping that it produces enough great things for everybody so that everybody's happy. You need to let them participate. This is the big crux on the federalism issue. Even without ever closer union and a big federal superstate, we need more participation. The problem is, who wants it? I don't see anybody really making a proposal.
The position of Europe in the 21st century. The big question is, are we going to lose the race with the BRICS?
No, we're not going to lose the race with the BRICS because the BRICS are not really all that successful. I think we're completely and largely overestimating what's going on there. The rise of the BRICS has two elements in it. There's an economic rise, which is, there's no doubt about it. It's undisputed. And then there's a political rise, and that's very much in doubt. China is learning the hard way that the political system, needs reform if it wants to survive that enormous economic growth. There's no society in the world that can grow for 30 years at 10% a year and not have a severe political impact also coming out of that. Brazil seems to grow but has its own problems. still a very unstable, political setup, and very, very little ambition to play a major role at the world stage. India, the same thing. Shaky political system, high corruption, not very innovative. A huge power, but with very little foreign policy ambition and huge domestic problems. South Africa, similar thing. It's probably going to, be a very crisis-ridden country very soon. Russia is entirely dependent on energy prices, its nuclear weapons, and a seat in the Security Council. Yeah, there's no really structural power base for Russia. Demographics look bad, socioeconomic data is bad, education is bad, health is bad, and even the life expectancy is going down. Nobody wants to be like Russia. There's no soft power in Russia, so except maybe the Belarusians and Mr. Lukashenko. And so I don't see them. I mean, they're certainly a powerful nuisance, but they're not a shaper. They're not a constructive force that shapes the international sphere, at least not in the long run. And so, we are not going to lose the race with the BRICS. We can only lose the future, in the race against ourselves. If we decide not to reform ourselves, if we decide not to realize what we need to do in order to win the future, we will lose or win the future at home, not, in the race against them. The race at home means, of course, to also convince people that we need to be a bit more in terms of, foreign policy player in the world, because we want Western standards and liberal, open societies to prevail. But at the same time, the question for our future doesn't lie in China or Brazil. The future lies here, and so it's all nice to be mesmerized by the rise of China, and it's good to find a strategic answer to that in foreign policy terms. But our primary homework is to reform our own societies to make them fit for the future.
How unstable will the world be in, let's say, 15 or 20 years?
That depends entirely on whether the BRICS and the rising powers, which will continue to rise in many cases, are ready to play a constructive role in upholding a halfway liberal world order. If Russia and China and some others decide that they are interested in a norms-based and rules-based international interaction, in peaceful conflict resolution, in peaceful arbitration on territorial conflicts, in keeping the lid on the North Koreans, in curbing proliferation, all of the stuff that in the end, in the current system, still depends very much on American authority. If they are ready to turn their new power into responsible stakeholdership, then we will have a bright and stable global scene for the most part.
Any signs this is happening, that they are taking up their responsibility? In Iran or in Syria or other major areas? Well,
at the moment it's still very disappointing. In Syria we don't see much of that. In the Iran case that's slightly different. I think there it's a bit more constructive. I think it's still at an early stage, especially when you look at China. China in the Libya case, for the first time, really had an overseas operation where it needed to evacuate a couple of 10,000 of Chinese, both by ship and by plane, because the Chinese were economically interested and invested in Libya. And when the Libya operation started, and the revolution started really, they wanted, to save their own people. So even though the Chinese have a relatively reluctant kind of, policy in terms of engaging with the world, their international and global investments as an economic power will drag them out of their foxhole. They will have to come out because all of a sudden there's interests to protect. This is the kind of macro level analysis, how that's going to play out, and whether the Chinese are going to embrace this and turn it into a constructive agenda, or whether it's going to be entirely reactive, and only really if they have to, they will engage. That's the big question. But potentially, of course, the Chinese will have to move because they're not, China any longer. They're also China that matters to the world, and the world matters to China, and that will have consequences. When you look at the global risk map, at the hotspots on the planet, where you aggregate data on social unrest and economic crisis and war and all of that put together, and you put that on a map, about 2/3 of the hotspot on the planet are in a semicircle around Europe. Starting with Russia and Eastern Europe, into the Balkans and the Caucasus, all the way down into the Middle East, and then over to North Africa and the Sahel. And it's a nice, wonderful little semicircle. 2/3 of the hotspots are there in our neighborhood. And the rest is scattered around the planet. Some are in Asia, some are in Latin America, some are in Africa. And so you could make the case that really, Europe is in that very special kind of very central place where most of the conflicts are somewhere around it. So which one is going to break out, which one is going to be the next kind of major security crisis for Europe is very, very hard to say. My feeling is that that Eastern Europe and the Caucasus are potentially the hotter parts, are the ones that are more relevant for us. I think even though the Middle East and the Arab world looks a lot hotter, it's probably going to matter less to us, partly because we don't want it to matter for us. We just love to blend it out and leave it to the side. But Eastern Europe will be very difficult for us to blend out. So my feeling is that this is going to be a center of gravity for our attention for some time to come. But, it could very well be another kind of outbreak of unrest in Northern Africa. And then we have another kind of, Afghanistan-like or Somalia-like situation somewhere closer to us, which already prompted us to intervene in Mali. And to a lesser extent also in Libya, it's hard to predict where the next real hotspot will be, but that our neighborhood is riddled with potential hotspots is very, very clear. Now, are we prepared for this? I think we're only very, very partially prepared for it. I think we have very little strategic understanding. Of course, when you talk to the Euro bubble people and when you talk to some foreign policy analysts, they agree on these kinds of things. And there's a general kind of agreement of what is dangerous for Europe. There's no shortage in analysis and in correct analysis. The shortage is in the political will to actually do something about it. And that has something to do with the fact that all of the kind of big measures that you can take are very, very costly, both politically and fiscally. You need a certain kind of military capability to be prepared. You need a certain kind of diplomatic clout to be prepared. That's costly. You probably have to, in order to have an impact on your neighborhood, you have to either be willing to let these people into the EU, which is costly, politically costly for the most part. In economic terms, it's actually quite a bargain. Or if you can't let them into the EU, you maybe want to open your markets, or you want to invest very, very heavily in lifting their standard of living so that they don't become a nuisance for you in the neighborhood. All of that is costly, enormously costly, and all of it is very long term. All of it means that you need to think about it in terms of a generation, and perhaps longer. For that, very few people are ready. For the kinds of investments politically and fiscally, and for the kind of fact that, if you start a project now as a big political leader in Europe, you will not see the fruit of your efforts. You will not reap the harvest, because in 4 or 8 years you're out of power, and that's not even the start of it. So the incentives for thinking along those lines are very, very low, and so I think strategically the mindset still needs to develop. The crisis has kind of ebbed away at least a little bit. And there are now the looming questions of what does all of this crisis mean for the future of Europe. We've put into place all of these immense integration steps, potentially a banking union, 6-packs and 2-packs and stability mechanisms and a transfer union light, as I would call it. Huge steps towards integration, really, if you look at it, at least in the Eurozone. And now all of a sudden we need to back this up politically. The crisis has accelerated integration in an interesting way, and that makes, that makes some kind of political process that accompanies this even more necessary. But you have to do it in an intelligent way so that you don't create just more of the bubble, but you create an intelligent, breathing political system that lets people in and participate, as I said earlier. We're talking about a very, very difficult situation in which the answers to the problems have to be so sophisticated and so not simplistic that it's very, very difficult to get all of that done. There's no appetite for treaty change to get this kind of thing done. How do you create more Europe, in a meaningful way that doesn't annoy and alienate more people, doesn't get more flack from populists, um, does the right kinds of things together and leaves other things alone, and then also legitimize that politically. That's the big, the Harry Potter question for Europe. In the last 24 years since the wall came down and since globalization took off at rapid speed, we are in an enormous adjustment battle, how we can turn this 20th century continent into something that can survive in the 21st. Historians will look at this as a period of adjustment, where we tried to work together more, but where we found that very difficult, where we tried to adapt our lifestyles to a globalized environment, and where we struggled and had all kinds of ideas about it. We had all kinds of ideas about it at the multilateral level, WTO, G20, the EU, all of that is part of this. When you look at it from a bird's eye perspective, you see us frantically scrambling for some model of order, because we've lost order, and order will get lost even further. And this frantic struggling in the European parliamentary elections will be a very nice, interesting little kind of flashpoint that illustrates that battle very clearly. I think we will probably have to make a few very decisive decisions over the next 5 to 7 years. Or if we don't make them, something's got to give, something will happen. So the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years will be crucial. But the point is that it will never end. Adjustment will just continue. And this is why this entire debate about finalité, about what's the end purpose and the end stage of European integration, is completely pointless. Because what's the end stage of the Netherlands? What's the finalité of Germany? Right? I mean, what's the kind of final construction of France, at which point it will just stop to develop and stay as it is? There is no such thing. Things will always develop and new challenges will come up, and we're right in the middle of that adaptation phase, and that will continue. We had this enormously stable 50 years after the Second World War, a complete kind of gravity-free zone where we had enormous stability, almost nothing moved, time was frozen, we had some modernization, but the real breakthrough came only after the end of the Cold War with the internet and globalization. And all of our political elites got socialized in that enormous period of stability. And all of our people and populations got socialized, including myself, Those endless wonderful evenings in the 80s when everything was wonderful and stable and nothing ever happened. And we all want to go back there. We think that we can somehow go back to a great moment of zero gravity, order, peace, and nothing happens, and the planet is calm, and we as the West are on top of the planet. We're the coolest dudes on the planet. That time will never come back. We will never be the coolest dudes on the planet anymore. We're pretty cool still, but there are other cool dudes on the block as well now. Stability will not come back. That moment of zero gravity is over. We are getting into a more diverse and more multipolar or non-polar world, where we don't have a dominating power that, sees to it that order is roughly, taken care of. And so adaptation will continue, and it will continue for as long as we all live.
Thank you very much for your time.